Boker Tov, Shavua Tov. Yeah, that's our signal for beginning. Our shiur today, as the rest of the series, is dedicated to Ilui Nishmat Rafael Moshe Ben Eliyahu. And our shiur will discuss today a very interesting figure with even more interesting work. The name, which is not necessarily a household name, is Rabbi Yaakov Culi. That's the way it's being pronounced usually, Rabbi Yaakov Culi. In English, it's C-U-L-I, but I suspect that the right pronunciation back then, at the time, was Culi. I would explain later why I think that's the case. Anyway, Rabbi Yaakov Culi, I would use Culi, although I do think it's a mistake, but it's the way it's being called the last 200 years. So if all due respect to my understandings, I will leave that aside. So Rabbi Yaakov Culi was born in 1689. So for us, in the course of this series, that is a little going back in time, backwards, but there is a good reason. I think there is a good reason for me teaching about him today, and I don't mean today because today is the 1st of January, I don't hold of these dates, but because today is the 8th of Tevet. What is so special about the 8th of Tevet? We'll speak Be'ezrat Hashem, I hope, during the shiur. Now, Rabbi Yaakov Culi was born in Yerushalayim. And his father was called Rabbi Machir. Machir, that's a biblical name, that's a name from the Tanakh, as Machir ben Menashe. His father was Machir. Now, his father came from what the Jews called Kendia. Kendia is Kritim, or Crete. Right, that's how they pronounce in English. Crete, in Greek. So he's from Greece, and his father, and without going into all the details, we have to know that Greece was in the middle between the Ottoman Empire and the Europeans. So more or less as the rest of the Balkan. So they were, from time to time, they were changing hands. Sometimes the Ottomans, the Turks, would rule them, and sometimes it would be the Venetians, for example, or other Christian empires. Now, the Jews had a long-lasting presence in Crete, and the Machir family, or the Culi family, was a very well-established family of Rabbanim and heads of the community, and rich, so everything was nice. But as the wars were waging on, as always, the side that no matter who would win, this side would lose, you all already know, that is the Jewish side. So if that would be the Turks, that would be able to overcome, or the Venetians, the first thing when they would come in, they would say, who here is a traitor? Obviously, the Jews are the traitors. So they, in the good scenario, they would only find them. That's the easiest way. Many, many times, it would be torturing people, it would be expelling people, it would be murdering people. And in one of these instances, Rabbi Machir, again, this is the father of our hero, he decides that he is leaving Greece, and if he is leaving Greece already, then he would come no less than to Jerusalem, to Eretz Israel. That happened in 1688. So Rabbi Machir comes to Jerusalem, makes an aliyah, which we heard just a few minutes ago, is the best decision a person can make in his life. So he's making aliyah, and he's coming to Jerusalem. He's a young guy, a young man. He's coming to Jerusalem, and in Jerusalem, he meets Rabbi Moshe ben Chaviv. Now, Rabbi Moshe ben Chaviv was one of the greatest poskim in the Spanish world, in the Sephardic world, in the 17th century. An extremely scholar, an extremely important man. And Rabbi Moshe ben Chaviv is really impressed by this young guy, Rabbi Machir Culi. He is so impressed that he gives him his daughter to marry. Beautiful, beautiful. So they have a wedding, and Rabbi Machir is, as you can imagine, is having a child, and the child is the hero of our shiur, that is Rabbi Yaakov Culi. However, things, as always, do not remain ideal for long. And we already saw that is a returning theme, unfortunately, that women were in a very dangerous situation back then, especially giving birth, and especially in Yerushalayim, where a sanitary or any, what we would call today, meaning there was no modern medicine, because there was no, modernity didn't come yet, especially not to Yerushalayim or to Israel of the Palestine of the time. But it was not even what could be offered in more advanced cities around the world was not to be given in Yerushalayim, which was a backward province of a backward empire. So that's not a place in which you want to be if you are sick. And the mother of Rabbi Yaakov Culi dies in a young age, so we don't have the exact date, but it seems that it was around the age that our hero, that Yaakov, is 9 years old. We do know that when he was 10 years old, his father already remarries. So again, I don't have the exact date, but it seems it would be a fair guess to say that his mother died when he was 9 years old. So his father remarries, and this time he remarries with, it's interesting, with an Ashkenazi woman. As a matter of fact, with the granddaughter of the chief rabbi of Budin. Now, Budin is a city which is now part of Budapest. Right? Budapest is made out of two different cities, Buda and Pest. In the Jewish lingo, it's called Budin. And the chief rabbi, back then, Budin was still a separate city. And the chief rabbi of Budin had his son going over to Yerushalayim, because in Yerushalayim you could meet, Ashkenazic and Sephardic Jews could meet. So he had his son going to Yerushalayim, and his granddaughter now marries this young widow. Do you say widow for a man? Okay, so this young widower. So this young widower, and she becomes the stepmother of Rabbi Yaakov. Now, I emphasize that because it seems that it gave the young Yaakov an ability to take and to learn from different sources, from his Sephardic origin, but also his Ashkenazic mother gave him a lot of the traditions, because many times the traditions in the house, of course back then, but if you'd excuse me, also nowadays, many times the nature of the house, the traditions that would be transmitted, with all due respect to the father, in the end would be decided by the mother. So Rabbi Yaakov had this experience of having both Sephardic origins, but also being very much, you can imagine if she's the granddaughter of the chief rabbi of Budin, so we are speaking about a very strong Ashkenazic influence, and he is able to be fed from both of these pipes, and that is going to be very important as he would continue. Now, his father, it is very clear, his father was a very learned man, and also it seems very, I would say, very strong in his character, in his nature. So the son tells us how his father would sit and learn from rise to dawn, and he would fast for days on days. And it seems that the son quote this line of character from his father. So he is also going to invest his time and his life in learning. But also we have to remember, the grandfather of this young child that we are now speaking about is no other than Rabbi Moshe ibn Habib. who is, as we said earlier, is the most important posek in the Sephardic world. So although his mother died, so the immediate connection to Rabbi Moshe ben Chaviv was somewhat severed or somewhat separated, but nonetheless, he is seeing himself as carrying the heritage of the great posek Rabbi Moshe ben Chaviv. Now the family moved to Tzefat. After being remarried, he didn't remain in Jerusalem, but moved to Tzfat. Now we are not being told exactly why did they want to move. Maybe because the new wife didn't want to live in Jerusalem. We do know that the situation of the Jews in Eretz Israel was not very good. There were two problems that were interconnected. One was there was a famine. There was not enough rain, and the Turks didn't build desalination plants in order to give water, and there was no Movil Artzi to bring water from the Kinneret to the rest of the land. So when you do not have rain, you are in very big problems. And if it happens for a few years, one after the other, then you are in real trouble. People die, and people died. And interconnected to that, the Arabs, the Muslims would from time to time rise up against having these foreign elements in Israel. So they are not happy with even the Christians, they are not happy with having the Jews, and not happy does not only mean that they would sit in the coffee house or in their salon and rant about it. They are going to act. And that's that may be disastrous, as you can imagine. And when people are hungry, they are much more likely to stand up and act violently, because they are thinking maybe about looting, maybe about killing the competition for food. So there are very good reasons why to be violent in time of famine. So the Jews are in a tzara, they are in a big trouble. And as a matter of fact, we do have a testimony by Rabbi Yaakov Culi, if you look at source Bet. That he writes 20 years, 30 years later. ודעו, he says in the book we would speak about, אם ירצה השם. You should know, כי מצווה גדולה היא לעשות צדקה עם עניי ארץ ישראל. You should know it's a great mitzvah to donate, charity, to send money to the poor people of Eretz Israel. And they live in Yerushalayim, in Hebron, and in Tzfat. והם קודמים לעניי חוץ לארץ. He says, even if you live in חוץ לארץ, and you have your own needy in your vicinity, still send your money, or at least some of it, to Eretz Israel. Why? Because the poor people in Eretz Israel are in much more difficult situation. Your needy people in Chutz La'aretz may have a problem to go to the store and buy food, but the people in Eretz Israel may really, their life is in danger. And he explained why. ויש להם צער הרבה מן האומות, they are suffering from the nations, והכל מצווים לעוזרם, so everyone must help them. כי עושים בזה מצוות פדיון שבוים, by that you redeem the captives. They are like always being captives by the nations, by the goyim, by the Muslims, by the Turks. I skip a little. ולכן, you see the second paragraph in source bet. ולכן אנו הדרים בחוץ לארץ, we, because he already left Israel when he writes these words, we living in חוץ לארץ, ואין לנו זכות לבוא לארץ ישראל, we did not merit yet to come and live in ארץ ישראל, חייבים לסייע, we must help, we must support the people sitting in Israel, כדי שיוכלו להיות שם במנוחה, so they can rest there, וכן כדי שיוכלו להתפלל, so they can daven, and then they would also help our davening, because we have to remember, all davening, when we daven, we always daven to the direction of Yerushalayim. So if there would be a problem in Yerushalayim, there would be a traffic jam, to all of the tefillot. So we must help the Jews in Yerushalayim. He is giving the people in לערץ, right, some incentives in order to donate. He says, you should make sure that everything is going easily, swiftly, up to heaven in Yerushalayim. And he explained, because אם לא נתמוך בהם, באות עליהם עלילות קשות מאת אדוניה. If you do not help them, then they are libels, blood libels, coming from the masters of the land, from the rulers of the land. And he says, והרעה הראשית, and the main problem they are dealing with, שנסגרות הקהילות, communities are being shut down. Oh, in Israel, there is such a problem. It's not only that individuals are living with problems. All communities evaporate. What? Yeah.
A question, because historically what I read, it's by that probably, I don't know exactly that time, that Jews were majority in Yerushalayim. There were 7,000 Jews and 2,500 Muslims and probably 2,000
that's in the middle of the 18th century. We are speaking now at the beginning. So things are slowly changing, but the Ottoman Empire, they are not helping that in any way. They are not helping that in any way. He says, אף על פי שאינם עושים זאת, it may be that the goyim do not by intention closing down the communities, אבל היהודים מתחבאים מפני הרעות, והקהילות נסגרות ממילא. The Jews have to scatter in order to avoid the problems, the pogroms, and the communities are, as I said, they are dismembered, they close down. And then no one davens, ואין מתפללים שם, כי התושבים מתחבאים מתחת לאדמה. It says the Jewish residents had to hide underneath ground. So that's always, I guess, that they built some hiding places. And then he says, very interesting, מאחר שנולדתי וגודלתי באותם המקומות, says, I know, I was born there, and I was bred there, I was raised there. So I know what I'm speaking about. ראיתי את הרעות שמצאו אותם. I saw these evil things that happened to them. And then he says, בוודאי העבדים הנמצאים במלטה, יש להם מנוחה יותר מאשר אלו. He says, even the slaves in Malta, which I guess was famous for overworking, their slaves, says, but they have more rest than the Jews in Eretz Israel. So that's his description of the situation in Eretz Israel. You can continue, but that's, I guess, I hope that more or less gives the impression. So I guess that's the reason why they left Yerushalayim to Tzfat. Maybe they tried to improve their situation. What does it do in Tzfat? So as I told you earlier, Rabbi Yaakov Culi, I allow myself already to call him Rabbi. So he's already 15, 16. And he's, but you know, these guys that we are speaking about in this shiurim, they in the age of 15 usually would do much more than what I would do, I guess, Bezrat Hashem in the rest of my long life. But nonetheless, they in the age of 15 or 16 are very advanced. So what is he doing? He took from Yerushalayim when they left, he took the manuscripts of his grandfather, and he is working on re-editing and preparing them to be published, to be printed. Because as we said a few times, one of the problems of the Jews under the Ottoman Empire is that the Ottomans did not allow for printing press. They saw it as a threatening element. You begin to print, who knows what will you print? So they are not allowing printing. The only printing press is in Constantinople, in the capital city, and there you have strict supervision by the Muslim and the Ottoman authorities. So the plan is, so there is no printing press in Yerushalayim, obviously. The plan is that in Tzfat, Rabbi Yaakov would sit and edit the manuscript of his grandfather, and then he would go to Constantinople and print the Sepharim, print the books. what is very soon to be discovered is that this young guy is excellent in editing. He's an excellent editor. Now, that's a thing that we have to remember. Usually, we are learning the works of our great rabbis. No one is thinking about the editor, right? When you read a book, not even in a Kodesh book, a secular book, no one, you have an author here, no one thinks about the editor. People think about the writer, such a beautiful writing. Sometimes the editor is taking off more than what remains. So you can say that in a certain extent, to a certain manner, in a certain way, a book is a shared work, is a co-work of the author and the editor. Obviously, it depends. Some editors are more heavy-handed. Some of them are more light-handed. Sometimes you as the reader regret that the editor was not more heavy-handed. So Rabbi Yaakov Culi is being revealed as a wonderful editor. He really edits. What I mean is, he is not obviously writing anything that was not there before, but he allows himself more of a free hand. I guess because he was also the grandson, so he saw himself as having the right to intervene. So everything comes out very smooth, very understandable, very clear, concise. If I would have a better English vocabulary, I would use another few words, but I hope that I give you the message. So it is very, very sharp. And he finished editing in Tzefat, and he goes, as I said, to Constantinople in order to print. Now, there is something very interesting about editors. As I said, it is somewhat of a transparent work being an editor, right? Because in the end, the name on the Sefer would not be yours. Would not be yours. So that is working in the shadows. Not everyone can do that. You need a certain type of personality to be able and to want to work so much on something, but in the end, no one even think about you. When nowadays we have these books that Rabbi Yaakov Culi printed, I can give you the names. In the yeshiva they're being learned to this day. It's called Shemot Ba'aretz. That's on Get Pashut on Gittin. Is considered one of the most important psika books in the halachot of Gittin. And he has Kapot Marim on Sukkah and others. All of them were edited by Rabbi Yaakov Culi. No one, if you'd go to the yeshiva and you'd ask, whose book is it? So they would say, Ma'aram Ibn Chaviv. They, of course, would be completely right. No one remembers the editor. So he comes to Constantinople. And fine, he's a good editor. In Constantinople, he meets with Rabbi Yehuda Rosanis. Rabbi Yehuda Rosanis is another great Sephardic rabbi. Great Sephardic rabbi. And he speaks with this young Yaakov Culi. He is in the age of, he came to Constantinople in 1740. So if you'd help me in a second, if he was born in 89, then 25. 25, he's a young man. He's a young man. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם שהכל נהיה בדברו. He meets Rabbi Yehuda Rosanis. As the Rabbi Yehuda Rosanis is heavily impressed, not only with the editing skills of the young man, but also with his own knowledge and scholarship. He is able to write his own books. But right now, as he is very humble, and as he sees his life mission, at least in this point in time, in this station of his life, he sees as his life's mission to bring into light, to publish the Torah of his grandfather. So Rabbi Yehuda Rosanis says, fine, you'd continue to work on publishing the Torah of your grandfather. He is matching him with we'll say today, a donor, right? A sponsor, a patron that sponsor his life in Constantinople. so he's able to sit down and walk. And he also says, I invite you to join the rabbinic court, the Padion of Constantinople. Now, the Padion of Constantinople, that's the capital of the Ottoman Empire. So that is the chief rabbi is Rabbi Yehuda Rosanis. And people send him questions from all over. When you sit in the rabbinic court of Rabbi Yehuda Rosanis, that means that you are very skilled, very talented, and also exposed to questions, inquiries, and also halachic opinions from the whole world. When you sit on Constantinople, you are able, nowadays, I was sitting yesterday night and preparing this shiur, and nowadays you can, from your computer, you can read articles from all over the world and read sefarim from all over the world, but you all know that is a phenomenon of the just recent 10 years or 15 years. And before that, your knowledge was as wide as your library. That's that's how it was. If you didn't have the sefer, you didn't have the sefer, and that's the end of it. And coming to a place like Constantinople meant that he was exposed to the greatest libraries of Jewish knowledge and Torah. And he is not one to just, buy books in order to have nice bindings in his library. He really reads them. So he is growing in leaps and bounds. His Torah knowledge is expanding and expanding. And he finishes editing, the sefarim of his late grandfather. But then something terrible happens. Rabbi Yehuda Rosanis himself dies, not in a very old age. And guess what? His writings remained in a very unruly condition. Who do you think would be chosen as the editor to the sefarim of Rabbi Yehuda Rosanis? So the family of Rabbi Yehuda Rosanis, he had two brothers that survived him and also were great rabbis. And the rest of the rabbis of Constantinople approach our hero, Rabbi Yaakov Culi, and say to him, you know what? You are such an excellent editor. You just finished editing the books of your grandfather. Please now sit down and edit the books of Rabbi Yehuda Rosanis. Now, here it was much more difficult work than with his grandfather, because his grandfather really wrote manuscripts, and the manuscripts were prepared. You needed to edit them, but they were prepared as a book. Not so was the case with Rabbi Yehuda Rosanis. Here you had notes from lectures, you had responsa that he wrote, you had drashot that he gave, and that was just, piles of pages. How do you make that into something palpable, into something that you can sell as a book, something that you can read? So he's sitting now to do a much more extensive work of editing, even than what he did with his grandfather. Because what he's going to do is to lefarek, right? To take apart the chidushim and the answers, and take them and make them into small bits, and then rebuild them anew. And he decides that he would print two books, two sefarim from Rabbi Yehuda Rosanis. One is called the Parashat Drachim. That is the drasha book. And again, some of the drashot were given by Rabbi Yehuda Rosanis as they are written in the book, but many of them are, it's like a work of a pesifas, mosaic work. You take these small building pieces, and now everything is from Rabbi Yehuda Rosanis. Nothing was made up by Rabbi Yaakov Culi. But the building, the structure, is from him. That's something that is really an achievement. And again, it is transparent, because in the end, you read the Parashat Drachim, the drashot, and these are very pilpulistic drashot. So for example, the first drasha, in the Parashat Drachim, discusses the question: Did the Avot fulfilled all the mitzvot of the Torah? And if they did, and then how, for example, Yaakov was able to marry two sisters, etc., etc., etc. Now you can see where he's going with that. And then for example, the machloikes, the dispute between Yosef and the brothers was that Yosef thought that they still have the laws of Bnei Noach, right? Because the Torah was not given yet. So even that they were fulfilling the mitzvot of the Torah, but they only can do it lechumra and not lekula, because they are still considered as Gentiles, as it may. And the Achim, the brothers, thought that they are already can be considered as Israelites, as Jews. And so they can enjoy some leniencies that Jews have. Now, for example, when you shachet, when you slaughter an animal, and you already cut the windpipe, but the animal did not die yet. So for Jews, it's already allowed to be eaten, because when the slaughtering was done, then the animal is considered kosher. But for non-Jews, they must wait for the animal to die. Now, truth of the matter, you understand that that's a very small, minor detail. But according to the Parshat Drachim, that was the... You remember that it says that Yosef brought slander against the brothers to his father, Motzi dibatam. So he says that was the diba, that he said that they are eating non-kosher. How can you say that the Achim ate non-kosher? They ate non-kosher because it depends. Do you consider them as Jews or do you consider them as non-Jews? That is the type of work that he's engaging in. I think it's highly interesting, but obviously you need a certain type of personality in order to be engaged by that. Somewhat of a lawyer. Yeah. Be it as it may, so that was one work, the Parshat Drachim. The second work, he took all of the halachic writings of Rabbi Yehuda Rosanis, which are much more than the Parshat Drachim, than the Drashot, and rearranged them according to the order of the Rambam. So he wrote a Peirush on the Rambam, built from his notes from Rabbi Yehuda Rosanis. Now again, Rabbi Yehuda Rosanis never wrote any Peirush on the Rambam. The whole thing is a creation of Rabbi Yaakov Culi from the building blocks of the notes and responses from Rabbi Yehuda Rosanis. So that's again an amazing work. There he allowed himself a little more, and sometimes he's adding his own chidushim in brackets. And brackets. Thank you. In brackets, he's adding his own chidushim. So that is something that you do find in the Mishneh LaMelech. And the Mishneh LaMelech is printed to this day in all standard editions of the Rambam. So again, that's a major feat. That's for a 25, 26 years old guy. It's a major feat. After it took him a few years. Again, I brought in the sources you can read. I because of time considerations, I do not read from inside. So every time I prepare all this show, it takes me hours, and we do not read. Okay. I would read in a minute. I would read something else. But you can see in source Daled, that is his introduction to the Mishneh LaMelech, and there he explained it took him years to compile the Mishneh LaMelech from all the bits and pieces that Rabbi Yehuda Rosanis left behind him. And then, in the age around 1729, so around the age of 40, he finishes with editing the work of his grandfather and the work of Rabbi Yehuda Rosanis, and finally can do to his own home. Right? That's the time he can publish his own work. Now, you would expect someone in this magnitude. So we speak about someone that is able to write the Torah of Rabbi Moshe Ibn Chaviv, to write the Torah of Rabbi Yehuda Rosanis. He is a Dayan in the highest court in the Sephardic world. He could easily write a rabbinic work of the first order. There is no question about it. But here he does something that is unthinkable. And instead of writing the next, I don't know, next Mishneh LaMelech, which would be the next Perush on the Shulchan Aruch, he decides to open the first art scroll. That's art scroll, right? Right. He's doing Steinsaltz. He's doing Sutenstein. He decides, and that is something I think which is very, very interesting. He says, I can write another Perush on the Shulchan Aruch, but you know what? There are enough Rabbanim that would write a very good Perush on the Shulchan Aruch that would help other Rabbanim to give psika. There are not so many Rabbanim that has the ability, the lucidity to write in a way that everyone can understand. So he says, my life mission should not be writing another top of the notch Perush on Shas or on Shulchan Aruch. He can do it easily. But the skills that were given to me by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, if to put them to the best use I can, is to take the Torah which exists and try to rewrite it, to reorganize it in a way that would be readable, would be understandable to the standard Jew of the Ottoman Empire. And here we have to understand, the situation was not very good. While you have great Rabbanim in the Sephardic world, but the masses were uneducated, unlearned. Not in the Ashkenaz, it was much better. It was a little better, but not much better. The masses were really masses, vulgar, unknowing, simpletons, ignorance. And Rabbi Yaakov Culi says that is a problem. Now, we have to remember, we are only a few decades after the whole affair of Shabtai Tzvi. Some of his followers are still running around in places like Constantinople. Constantinople, thank you. The Jews, by the way, called it Kushta. So they solved this problem. So...
Can I tell the story about the matzah?
It's recorded, so afterwards.
We'll stay late. So,
Rabbi Yaakov Culi decides, so as I said, there are still Jews running around, following, they are Sabbateans. And you know where these type of things, where they breed? On ground of ignorance. When people do not have real content to fill their minds and to fill their hearts, so there is no vacuum. If there is no real content, then false messiahs are able to sell their merchandise. People that know what they are looking for and how does a real religious experience look like, they have, I'm not saying that it's 100% protected, but they are less in a risk to fall to the clutches of charlatans. So it may be because of the Sabbateans. Also, I think the major reason is that as Jews, we always aspire to educate the people in Torah, and by that to get them closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And he decides that he would write what is called Yalkut Me'am Loez. Now, what is the Yalkut Me'am Loez? Now let's read a little from inside. The Yalkut Me'am Loez has two introductions. One of them is in Ladino. The whole work is in Ladino. Now the whole work, I brought here only, that is Bereshit. Okay, so you can think about Shmot, we don't have it at all. Shmot, Vayikra, Bamidbar, Dvarim, and the rest of the 24 books of the Tanakh. Now, he didn't himself write the whole thing, as I had explained, but he wanted to. He created the program. As I said, he created the art scroll. Now, he wrote it in Ladino. So there is one introduction in Ladino, and there is another introduction in Ivrit, in Sfat HaKodesh, in Hebrew. And it is very clear that the Ladino introduction is meant to the people that would use the work, and the Hebrew introduction is to his rabbinical friends, explaining, what are you doing? Why are you wasting your powers in writing such a thing which is looked by them as very simple, as very low level? If you can be a rabbi in a yeshiva, why do you go to the kindergarten? That is what his rabbinical friends ask him. So first I would like to read with you a short summary of his Ladino introduction. It's a very long one. We are not going to read the whole thing. I gave you a bullet summary. And then we would read some of the Hebrew introduction. So let's begin. In source A, you would see, obviously it was translated into Hebrew in the late 60s of the 20th century. And that's the edition that we have here. By the way, there is also an English edition, which I only saw it in, meaning when I looked for in the internet. It's also very voluminous. But I thought I saw it here, but I didn't. I can. You got a few copies. Okay, so it can be attained. It can be bought. It is not going to be cheap because you are going to buy some 30 books, and you also need to buy a library in order to put it in.
We don't have those.
No, I know. So, what are his goals? Why does he write the ילקוט מעם לועז? First goal, he has 10. First goal, המטרה הראשונה, למען ידעו בני הדור את המצוות, כיצד יש לקיימן, ואת העבירות, כיצד להתרחק מהם. So he says, my first goal is to teach halacha. So that's very interesting, because the book is built on the Parshat HaShavua. But he says, my first goal is teaching halacha. We would see how he's doing that. He's in a brilliant way. Because he's, you see, I cannot even withhold myself. So he's giving you his perush on the psukim, and then he's giving you a midrash. He continued the story, and by continuing the story, he also tells you the halachot that are connected. And that is so good for memory. When you teach the halacha as part of a story, and not as something that stands disconnected. So, for example, in our parsha, he is speaking about Yaakov and Yosef meet, right? Which is such a dramatic moment that he describes in. I cannot read the Ladino, obviously, but it is clear. Everyone that writes about his writing in Ladino says that he writes it in a very colorful way. Now, the Hebrew somewhat transmit that, but I guess, as they say, the Yiddish is better. So he's writing in a very juicy way. And he writes the Midrash, brought also in Rashi, that when Yaakov and Yosef met, then Yosef fell on the neck of his father and cried his heart out. But Yaakov was not crying. How can it be that Yaakov was not crying? So the Midrash says because Yaakov was reading the Shema. He was saying the Kriyat Shema. So Rabbi Yaakov Culi is using that in order to discuss the halachot. When are you allowed to speak in shul, and when are you not allowed to speak in shul? And you would remember that. I don't know if it calls you to stop speaking in shul, but you at least remember. So that's beautiful. The way that now again, he's a great editor. So what is he doing? He's interweaving the halachot with the stories, and sometimes he tells you history, and he tells you, so everything, he took all of the Hebrew literature that these people it was inaccessible for them. They cannot read it. They can read only Ladino. And he is distilling it into one great magnum opus of the ילקוט מעם לועז. And it is very unfortunate, that I can speak only to myself, but I guess that what I'm sharing now, some of you at least would also join, it is underread, it is underrated in our communities. And that is a shame, because I think that we can also use his skill in reconnecting תורה שבכתב, with the oral Torah, with the תורה שבעל פה, with הלכה, with, as I said, with מדרשים, with stories, with מוסר. Everything is inside. Very, very beautiful. Second goal, להיטיב להבין את הניסים שעשה הקדוש ברוך הוא לאבותינו. We want people to understand the Chumash, to understand the miracles, explain, because again, these people maybe they can read the letters, the Hebrew letters they were able to read, just as people that were able to read Yiddish were reading Hebrew letters, but, and again, that's something that I know that in some places in L'Aretz happen. The child is being taught to read the Hebrew letters, but he has no idea what does he say. And that happened in the Sephardic world as well. So, okay, you are able to read the Chumash, but really you have no idea what you are reading. So I would translate that into Ladino, and I would give you the Torah. And I would give you, and you would finally understand what did happen in Yetziat Mitzrayim. Third goal, לקרוא בתורה שניים מקרא ואחד תרגום. So we are being, it's an halacha, it's a mitzvah, every Shabbat, before Shabbat, to read the mikra, to read the parsha twice, and then to read the targum, the translation. What translation? Well, Unkelus, Aramaic translation. I have something to tell you. In the Sephardic world, as well as in the Ashkenazic world, 95% of the people they cannot read the Hebrew, so give them also to read Aramaic. That is not going to help them in any way, which or shape or form. So if you really want to have Shnai Mikra ve'echad Targum, you need to translate that into a language they can understand. Ladino, they can understand. So he's giving them the key back to their heritage. He's returning to them Hashavat Aveidah, the object they lost. They lost the Torah, and he's enabling them to return to the treasure of the forefathers. Fourth goal, ליישב את כל השאלות המתעוררות בפרשה. So he's a real darshan. So he says, every question you have on the Parashat Shavua, you would find the answer in my sefer. Now, okay, that may be a little too far-fetched. There are many questions on the Parasha. You need more even than that in order to answer all the questions that one can have on the Parasha. But it's very good. He's counting, his introduction to the Yalkut Me'am Loez, he's counting more than 40 books that he used when creating this encyclopedia of Torah. And I read some studies, as I said, Google is excellent. I read some studies on the Yalkut Me'am Loez, and you know, there are pretty beautiful internet sites that you can use in order to research something. And they say that even the 40 books that he's listing there are less than 40% of what he really used. So I guess when he wrote the introduction, then he maybe, I don't know, maybe he didn't want to be too lengthy. So he really heavy a lot. And as I said, he set in his fingertips were almost all of the Jewish Sepharim that were available at the time. Fifth goal, המטרה החמישית, לתאר את המלחמות שאירעו בימי מלכי ישראל והנביאים. As I said, he began writing on the Torah, but his plans were, the program was to create the whole 24 Sfarim of the Tanakh. So he says, I want to teach you history through the Tanakh. Sefer Yoshua, Sefer Shoftim, Sefer Shmuel, Sefer Melachim. This is the history of the Jewish people. This is our identity. And you have people going around, you say to them, Yoav, they know, was he a king? Was he a prophet? Who was he? So you need to learn. They cannot, the Tanakh is inaccessible. They cannot read Sefer Shmuel. So I am going to read the whole thing in the Dino, with the Midrashim, with everything. Sixth, להביא דיני חושן משפט. Now that's very strange. I don't know why he decided that חושן משפט is so important from the 4 parts of the Shulchan Aruch. He says חושן משפט is something that every Jew should know. Now חושן משפט is monetary issues. I guess that because he was a dayan on the Beit Din, on the rabbinical court, then he saw many mistakes that people were doing with monetary issues, So he felt a need to teach specifically this goal. He says, I saw many people lose their money because of financial mistakes. That's what he writes in the Hakdama introduction. Okay, so he says that's one of my goals, to teach monetary laws. Seventh goal, he says, כאן תמצאו את כל המעשיות הנמצאות בגמרא. He says, don't worry, all the stories in the Gemara, all the midrashim that we know that all live, we are all children in the end, right? We like stories, we love stories. That's why I'm giving this show. We love stories. I also love stories. So he says, don't worry, I'm going to give you, in this anthology, I'm going to give you all the stories in the Gemara and Midrashim. And he says, so you don't need to read anymore in foreign books. And he specify, do not read history books. I am not sure what he had against the history books of his time, but it seemed maybe they were from the Muslims, so they had things against Israel. He was really against them. He says, it's very interesting. He says, I know that in the long nights of Tevet, what we are now at, he says, people are bored. No, they didn't have TV yet. If they had TV, they were not bored anymore. But they were bored, so they were reading Sefarim, they were reading books, reading history books. He says, don't read history books. Read my Sefer. It has everything. It has even stories. So he's marketing. But you see, he's brilliant. He's brilliant because he knows what the men in the market would want. He's not writing for his fellow rabbis. He's writing for us, for the simple people. And he says, so it would, he says, ומלבד זה שתהיו עסוקים והזמן יעבור. So he says, I know that the long nights are really boring and you look how to kill time. So if you would read it, the time would pass. That's what he says. That's what he says. It says, but a part of that, it would also be of good use because you would learn something that is useful and not just your stupid books you are reading. Yes. The eighth goal is to describe the work of the Beit HaMikdash because we are very disconnected. So he says, I'm going to emphasize the korbanot. And the ninth goal, is to explain the stories of the Torah and the morals of the Torah. And the 10th goal is very interesting. He says, I struck a deal with this patron of mine. His name was Rabbi Yehuda Mizrahi. The first 1,000 copies, and by the way, that's a lot. 1,000 copies to print on the first run. It means you have a lot of confidence in selling your book. Shakespeare, by the way, was printed in a lot less than 1,000 copies in the first run. So he says, we're going to print 1,000 books in the first print. These 1,000 would be dedicated to cover the cost of the printing and to pay to me and for all the payments. Every sefer we will sell going over the 1,000, it's going for tzedakah to Eretz Israel. Wow. So that's both obviously a moral and religious goal and a very good selling point. A very good selling point. You are buying the sefer, so you earn twice. You get a sefer and you can see yourself as donating to Eretz Israel. I think he's the first one to create such, right? People are doing it to this day. Right? You buy these Gavia Kiddush and 90, right? And the donations would go to yeshiva or to something. So he's the first one thing to make it to think about that. So again, a brilliant man, a very, very, very interesting man, Rabbi Yaakov Culi. So that is why he is writing the book. But he knows that he is going to face opposition. There would be opposition because he writes it in Ladino. Now, we are, I said, in the 8th of Tevet. The 8th of Tevet, for many generations, was a fast day. We have a fast day in Tuesday, on Asara B'Tevet. But there was also a fast day on the 8th of Tevet. Why? Because according to our tradition, in the 8th of Tevet, the Torah was translated to Greek by the 70 elders. Now, I'm not going to try to say the name of the Greek translation. Thank you. That is right. Septuagint, yeah, but that's, yeah. Everyone has to know his limitations. So, and that was seen as a reason to mourn, to have a fast day. So that's something sad, something bad, something terrible that the Torah was translated. Why? Because you cannot really translate the Torah. You cannot really translate anything. Because every translation is also an interpretation. No language is identical to the other. You cannot just switch words. And so much more so with the Torah, the Holy Torah. Every word contains at least 70 interpretations. Shivim panim la Torah. In your translation, maybe you can cover one of them, but all the rest are lost. And people that would think that they can learn from a translation would, what they really do, they are depriving the Torah from its majesty, from its expansion. So translating the Torah was seen as a bad thing. And when he now rewrites so many svarim into Ladino in one work, but containing so much, he has explanation to make, not to the simple people. They do not ask this question. They are happy that he translated for them the Torah. But to his rabbi friends, why does he do that? If someone wants to learn Torah, then Torah is important enough for him. He needs to sit down and learn Hebrew, to learn Tzvat HaKodesh. And he writes in the Zakdama, and it's a little small letters. I apologize. I tried to put it into the page, so I'm not sure if you are able to read it. Okay, I'll just say it. I'll say it. And also, he writes it in a very flowery prose. So you would enjoy it later. I would just say the gist of it. He says, basically, I don't care. He says, there is a need by the people. Now we can sit in our ivory tower and speak about, yes, if someone wants to learn Torah, he needs to learn how to read the Hebrew and needs to understand, and he needs. And what happens in the field? What happens in the market? We lose everyone. So there is a limit to how much elitist you can be if you don't want to disconnect completely from the people. That's basically what he says. So he says, I know I would be criticized, but I am not the first one to do so. Unkelus did it before me. Rambam wrote in Perush Mishnah in Arabic. Rabbeinu Sadia Gaon wrote his Emunot ודעו, his book about Ashkafa in Arabic. So I'm not the first one to do so. And the people need that. And the hour calls for it. So it is my duty, as I have the ability to write it down, I have the knowledge of the Torah, I have the scope, I have the authority, I have the ability also to write in Ladino. So it is my job to create what we would call today, again, it's the arts called the mid-brow culture. Because you have the highbrow culture. You have the rabbis learning in the original language, beautiful. You have pop culture, which the history books that he's trying to prevent people from reading, right? And he's trying to create this mid-brow culture in which you engage people which are interested, curious, not stupid. They can be smart people, but they are not rabbis. They didn't sit in a yeshiva for 20 years. And you cannot expect them to sit in a yeshiva for 20 years. So do you want to lose all of them? It is better, he says, to lose some in order to benefit, to gain the many. And I think how does he avoid the pitfall of the Greek translation? The problem of the Greek translation was that it was a translation of the written Torah without any reference to the oral Torah. And by that, you disconnected yourself from the tradition of how the Torah is supposed to be read. But in Yalkut Me'am Loez, that's not what he's doing. He's not just giving you a translation of the Torah into Ladino. If that is what he was doing, then yes, that was very problematic. Because then someone from the market, again, can read it and think that he understood the Torah, as the truth cannot be any farther than that. but because he gives you all of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, distilled, as I said, into the psukim, with the halachot, with the midrashim, with the explanations. He is not disconnecting you from the Torah. He is reconnecting you into the Torah. And if someone would be interested enough, then you have the notes downstairs, and you can go to the real sources and look inside. And I'm sure many people did that. Just as people can begin to learn Gemara with the Sutenstein out of the art school, and many who just remain there, which is fine, because they learn Torah, which is beautiful. And for some, they would be so interested and so engaged that they would be sucked in, and they would say, you know what, I want this question. I read the English summary, but I do want to see why Rashi and Tosfot disagree. In order to do that, I must see the Hebrew. And you would go to the Hebrew once, twice, 3 times, and maybe, I'm sure it happened to many people. In the end, you would be able to read the original. It's not Hebrew, but it's Aramaic, but you would read in the original language. The Yalkut Me'am Loez was a hit, as a hit can be in the 18th century. It was printed more than 10 times. So I don't know how many of these prints fulfilled the promise that he had that any book beyond the 1,000 would be donated to Eretz Israel. I'm sure that everything that he printed went to Eretz Israel, but the other printers, I cannot give you guarantees for that. But it was printed more than 10 times in all of the 4 printing houses of the Sephardic world. Now, it was not printed in Ashkenaz for the simple reason they had Sena Verena. That was the Ashkenazic parallel of the Yalkut Me'am Loez. But me being Ashkenazic and loving our Ashkenazic forefathers, I have to say, the Yalkut Me'am Loez, it's much more impressive than the Tzena Ore. I apologize, but that's what it is. By the way, why did I say that his name apparently was Culi? Because he explains that he took Me'am Loez, because after, Me'am Loez is בצאת ישראל ממצרים, בית יעקב, יעקב חולי, בית יעקב מעם לועז, and also La'az is a foreign language, right? And a few psukim later it says, מלפני אדון חולי הארץ. So I guess it's a Culi and not a Culi, but it's we cannot know, right? It's a maybe. It's a maybe. So for 150 years, it was a great hit. And it is as I said, it's the magnum opus of the Ladino literature, rabbinical literature. However, in the first half of the 20th century, it was not printed at all. So it fell into disuse. And that is for 2 reasons. One is the Haskalah. And the Haskalah made some of what is going on here, because he gives you stories from the Gemara and science as he understood it, it became somewhat of obsolete. The second reason was that Ladino was falling out of use. So until it was translated in the middle of the 20th century into Hebrew and also into English, I don't know how the English version is doing. I have no idea if it is really having traction. The Hebrew is being taught. I so much wanted to have the Sepharim, but it's too much for our library. So I went to the library in our yeshiva, and they were bringing new edition. That was the old edition. And they told me that if I'm taking it for the shul, they would give it me for free. So you have in the room there the whole of the Torah, not of the Tanakh. He died in the age of 43, only 2.5 years after he began the project. So in the end, there was much of a manuscript that remained from him, but someone had to edit the notes. And there were 2 great rabbis that took it upon themselves. So unfortunately, only Bereshit and the first half of Shemot are really from him. The rest is from his notes, but edited by others. And when we have translation of that, so it is somewhat of a more far-fetched than what he did. Nonetheless, it's a great work. And as I said, I cannot recommend enough. At least 1 week, take the Yalkut Me'am Loez and try to read what he has to say on the Parsha. it's so interesting, it's so moving, many times educating, and even someone that really read many Pirushim still would have much more to learn. So although it's mid-bro, and we are all so highly educated people, still we have what to learn from the Yalkut Me'am Loez. And so I recommend, as I said, it's here in the room. Just take a look. If you want, this is the part that we are now in Vayigash and Vayechi. So you can look at it. And Be'ezrat Hashem, we would continue next week. Thank you very much. Have a Shavua Tov.
Thank you.
That's the story. I would stop the recording.